Hello, and welcome back to World History 1, Ancient and Medieval World History. My name is Dan Alasso, and I should mention that I am saying that not really for the benefit of my students, who I expect will know who I am by now, but because, although my students may not know this, I also post these videos on YouTube and Substack, where I have my own channels in both places called Making History, where I often post the history content that I make for my college courses so that the general public can see it too. Another thing that I should mention today is that along with this video, I've also created a website that includes the text and the images that I'm going to use here, where people can go and read what I'm saying here and also follow links and find more information. It's also someplace where my students will be able to join private groups that I set up in Hypothesis and socially annotate and comment and have a conversation with each other about the content that I'm talking about here. And so that is also available to people out on the World Wide Web who are interested and who may want to annotate and comment on this in public as well. But now let's get to the content. This is the second chapter, and I'll be using it in the second week of the course. And as I had hinted in the previous chapter, in addition to the agricultural and pastoral advances, that is herding, that had enabled the Neolithic Revolution or the agricultural revolution to happen, an equally or maybe even more important change was cultural. Some people seem to have shifted their lifestyles from being hunter-gatherers to being farmers during a period of several millennia, actually. So let's examine what all of that might mean to them culturally. In the ancient prehistoric world, the human population, of course, would have been much smaller and was probably, in most cases, at least initially, much more spread out. It seems reasonable to assume that, as they tend to do today, bands of people involved in hunting and gathering might have been small and might have been mobile. Inspired by anthropologists, historians have typically imagined them as extended families or clans, organizing themselves in groups of, say, 25 or so, and wandering the landscape in search of edible plants or following herds of game animals. Every once in a while, they might come together with other bands, possibly in seasonal festivals at which they would share news, share new knowledge, as well as giving young people the opportunity to find mates outside of their tiny communities of people who are all probably very closely related to each other. And one explanation that scholars have proposed for the building of monuments like Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe, and then later Stonehenge, of course, 5,000 years later, is that these sites may have been important meeting places for these ancient people. The social importance of the connections that these types of meetings may have fostered could easily have been understood by the community in spiritual terms that might lead to something like religious reverence for the locations of these events. But we should also question our assumptions about the lifestyles of these hunters and gatherers. As I mentioned previously, the fact that people living this lifestyle today tend to be confined to some of the most marginal land that nobody with more power actually wants, doesn't mean that ancient people found themselves in the same types of circumstances, at least at first. In fact, it's very likely that people who lived by gathering and hunting probably first occupied places where resources were most abundant. It seems reasonable to assume that at least some of the people living in such a land of milk and honey would prefer to stay put, and that their population would probably grow as a result. Although they might still organize their societies around small bands of closely related people, these bands would not be separated by such great distances as they would be where resources were scarce. We have no idea what these cultures might have looked like, although, like anthropologists, we might be able to make some guesses based on the ways that historical populations, such as Native Americans, organize themselves. But it becomes more plausible to imagine a population of pre-agricultural people building these large monuments, like the ones I've mentioned, if they weren't worrying about where their next meal was going to come from, day to day. But again, all of this begs the question, why then switch to agriculture? This, along with the curious simultaneity of agricultural developments worldwide, suggests a possible answer. As you'll recall, the 5 staple crops that we still depend on to feed the world today were all developed by different cultures in different places, beginning about 10,000 years ago. And although we can't rule it out, we don't have any evidence that cultures like the ancient Mesopotamians were in contact with the Chinese and talking about agricultural techniques. And it's extremely unlikely, bordering on impossible, that ancient Native Americans in what's now Mexico, Peru, and the Amazon knew about the agricultural developments that were happening in Europe and Asia and Africa, even if they might have been talking to each other. In the past, historians, or people adjacent to historians, have sometimes resorted to the supernatural to explain how these diverse and isolated cultures may have all managed to have the same revolutionary ideas at about the same time. While some have just chalked it up to coincidence, others have suggested some type of collective unconscious to explain these parallel developments. Others, who find themselves more on the fringes of magical thinking, have even imagined aliens or Atlanteans or some other long-forgotten advanced civilization that might have spread this knowledge to people throughout the world. Personally, I think this type of explanation, like many religious beliefs, I would have to say, just pushes the question back to another previous level, failing to really explain how those advanced people discovered these techniques. A more plausible answer might be that these techniques that led to the beginning of farming in all these different places may have been extremely ancient, possibly even developed before the ancestors of all of these diverse cultures went their separate ways. What if people who gathered plant foods noticed that seeds that they accidentally dropped in camp would grow into the very plants that they had gone to all the trouble of looking for and finding and bringing back to their homes? Certainly, people whose lives depended on the foods that they gathered would have been very likely to notice this type of thing and to take advantage of it. So if we imagine a culture of people who hunted and fished and gathered, and then maybe began cultivating valuable plants near their camps, we would be thinking of a people who supported themselves in a similar way to the woodland Native American tribes of the Northeast. We can't know, of course, whether people living in other parts of the world 10 or 15,000 years earlier would have developed the same types of social organizations. But it's certainly possible. And what would that mean? The native cultures of the northeastern woodlands were generally pretty egalitarian. They weren't necessarily peaceful. Bands or tribes often fought each other. But they also regularly incorporated captives into their societies, choosing between killing captives immediately or adopting them as full members of their bands. Men hunted big game, defended the band from predatory animals, which was a big deal early on when there were dangerous predators in America, and fought. And women gathered and fished and trapped small animals and grew the three sisters of corn, beans, and squash in garden plots that they shifted when the soil fertility began to wane. Because they controlled the more dependable, regular food sources, women had social power. They, typically in these native societies, were responsible for distributing all of the food. And they often chose the men who led councils and war parties. Often, family descent was matrilineal, passing through the mother, since it was easier to know who a person's mother was than their father. Now, it's impossible to know whether these types of social arrangements were practiced in the ancient world. Many historians have suggested, often on very shaky evidence and sometimes on wishful thinking, that before the age of patriarchic civilizations, there was an earlier culture period that was at least more equal, if not entirely led by women. Now, it seems to me that the natural differences in abilities and interest between the sexes suggests divisions of labor that could have consequences for social power. But it's very difficult to do more than speculate. In any case, it does seem plausible to imagine a very deep origin of the types of cultivation that could later have inspired these diverse and, by this time, isolated populations to develop farming and to begin altering plants into staple crops. And so the question remains, what happened when people began to do this? At some point between about 10,000 years ago and about 7,000 years ago, there seems to have been a gradual shift in which some people in relatively abundant regions, such as river valleys, began first cultivating food plants near their camps or villages, and then in several regions began altering the plants to make them more productive. It's probably worth mentioning that much of this work, maybe even all of this work, creating maize from teosinte, learning to freeze-dry potatoes and detoxify cassava, and identifying wheat and rice as valuable plants, was probably all done by women. Other farm work, such as yoking water buffalo or oxen to plows and building irrigation dikes and canals, was probably men's work. This possible division of labor probably didn't immediately change the social hierarchy or the status of women. There would have been just as much value added by the physical and mental contributions of women as those of men. And this type of value contribution probably resulted in social status. Now, the yoking of animals to plows points to the other major development of this era, which was the domestication of animals. Although gray wolves joined human communities in Central Asia and began becoming dogs about 33,000 years ago, the domestication of wild sheep and wild goats probably began in the Zagros Mountains in present-day Western Iran, Iraq, and Turkey between 12,000 and 10,000 years ago. Residents of archaeological sites like Ganj Dera and Tepe Garan, both about 10,000 years old, kept goats and sheep. And their remains, the skeletons of these goats and sheep, show changes, such as decreased horn size, that are taken as evidence of domestication. It's likely that hunters brought some live prey, or maybe the young, the babies of an animal that they had killed, back to their camps with them, and learned that it was sometimes easier to let the animals reproduce nearby, near home, than to go out and find wandering wild herds. For their part, the sheep and the goats apparently decided that regular feeding and protection from predators wasn't such a bad deal. Domesticating cows, which people managed slightly later than goats and sheep, must have been a little bit more difficult and scary. The ancestors of modern-day cattle were oryx, wild bovines that stood over 6 feet tall at the shoulder and had long, curved horns. They were very dangerous and now are extinct. Ancient people had hunted oryx for millennia, and they're featured in cave drawings and paintings from 40,000 to about 10,000 years ago at many sites, including Lascaux and Chauvet in France and Altamira in Spain. Their remains, also showing signs of early domestication, have also been found in slightly more recent layers at Ganj Dara, as well as at Çatalhöyük in Turkey and Jad el-Mughara in Syria. A separate domestication process in South Asia, possibly between 9,000 and 8,000 years ago, produced the distinctive Indian zebu cattle. Archaeological sites at Mehrgarh in Pakistan and Birana in India similarly contain skeletons with smaller body sizes and reduced horns, again suggesting domestication. By about 9,000 to 7,000 years ago, agricultural techniques, including both farming and herding, had spread from the places where they had developed into surrounding regions. The best studied of these spreads is from the Fertile Crescent into Europe. But I think we can assume that expansion in other regions happened over similar timescales and probably in similar ways. And this spread began in Anatolia, what's now Turkey, and entered Europe by way of the Mediterranean Sea and the Danube River. The first places reached by farming and farmers in Europe were in the eastern Mediterranean, where 8,500-year-old sites like Frankti Cave in Greece and the Starcevo Koros Kris, I'm probably mispronouncing that, culture in the Balkans show signs of farmers using pottery and polished stone tools and living in village settlements. By about 7,500 years ago, longhouses and distinctive pottery designs and intensive farming techniques had reached Hungary and Germany along the Danube. Although these agricultural innovations spread partly probably by migration of people and partly through cultural exchange, that is, people learning things from neighboring cultures, there was a significant amount of migration. Recent genetic analysis of residents of the Mediterranean island of Sardinia, for example, show that their genetic heritage derives between 80 and 90% from a group known as early European farmers, who were descended from these Anatolian migrants. Historians of the ancient world make distinctions between farmers and pastoralists, herders, that I think are going to be very valid a little later on, like when we talk about the Bronze Age cultures described in the Old Testament, but probably didn't apply immediately to the earliest stages of these two related agricultural developments. The separation of farmers and pastoralists into distinct and often hostile groups was probably not an issue in the earliest stages. Although it is possible that herding, like hunting, became a bit more of men's work, and farming, like gathering, women's. After the widespread adoption of ox-drawn plows, some of this farm work may have become more male-dominated. One interesting case study that we have that seems to be an example of both hostility and of the possible mixing of cultures and genes is the famous case of Ötzi the Iceman. He's a 5,300-year-old mummified body that was discovered in a melting glacier in the Alps between Austria and Italy in 1991. Ötzi was about 45 years old at the time of his death, and based on his stomach contents, had lived on a diet of ibex and chamois and red deer meat, along with acorn, wheat, roots, and small fruits like plums. Ötzi's genes show a very high proportion, over 90%, of Anatolian farmer ancestry. Now, although the early European farmers descended from the Anatolians had been in the region for centuries by Ötzi's time, it's possible there was still some hostility between these people and the earlier European hunter-gatherers, who seem to still have been living in this region. Ötzi seems to have been killed by being shot in the back with an arrow that shattered his scapula and caused him to bleed out. His own arrows seem to have the blood of two of his human enemies on them. Of course, it's also possible that he was killed in a personal dispute that was completely unrelated to his ancestry. That's just one of those mysteries of history. Now, historians and textbooks also frequently make a distinction between what they call transhumant pastoralists and nomads. Transhumant herding describes managing flocks or herds so that they don't really get too far from a central place, like a village or a town. Think of shepherds following flocks as they graze, but preventing them from wandering off too far. Or, in the more recent past, think of the Swiss grandfather in the story of Heidi, who seasonally took his cattle up and down the mountainside in the Swiss Alps to their summer pastures and then back to their winter barns. It's easy to imagine some continuity between the lifestyles of hunters in regions of relative abundance, like the river valleys, with that of transhumant shepherds. A bit more difficult to connect this lifestyle with that of nomadic pastoralism. Although archaeology shows that there were definitely small bands of nomadic hunter-gatherers struggling to survive in remote and barren regions of the ancient world, like the ancestors of the Beringians, whose 29,000-year-old camps have been found in Siberia. It is still probable that most people, when they had the option, preferred to live in rich environments, like temperate river valleys. Also, it wasn't that easy to survive far from water on the 4,000 or 5,000 mile wide seas of grass that made up the Central Asian steppes, or at least not until one of humanity's first major technological inventions, the wheel. It's impossible to determine exactly where the wheel and wheeled carts were first invented and developed, partly because the new technology was so valuable and exciting that it was instantly adopted by everyone who saw it. The earliest carts themselves have not survived. But there is an image of a cart drawn on a ceramic pot found in Central Europe that dates back to about 5,500 years ago. And then, a little later, ancient burial sites called kurgans in Ukraine actually contain wooden carts with solid wheels that are about 5,300 years old. Now, the significance of these carts is that they would have enabled people to venture out onto the steppe, carrying much larger water supplies in ceramic pots or in animal skins than they could have carried on foot or on horseback. Archaeological evidence suggests that the earliest cart users were transhumant rather than fully nomadic. They returned regularly to semi-permanent settlements, and analysis of isotopes such as oxygen and strontium in their bones suggests that they typically stayed within 100 miles or so of their homes. But as time passed, these early cart users were able to spread their culture westward into Europe and also probably eastward into Asia. The most significant of these cultures was known as the Yamnaya. These cart-using pastoralists originated in what's now Ukraine and eastern Russia about 5,300 years ago and spread through Europe over the next 700 years or so. Their style of pottery, known as corded ware, became prevalent by about 4,900 years ago throughout Central and Northern Europe, reaching as far as the Netherlands, the Baltic, and Scandinavia. The succeeding culture, which was also named after its own distinctive pottery style, the bell beaker, has been discovered to have been about 70% Yamnaya in their ancestry. Percentages of ancestry vary quite a bit by region, showing that there was quite a lot of chance involved in these meetings of natives and immigrants in different places. For example, the Sardinian islanders that I mentioned previously, who were relatively protected from these new immigrants, the Yamnaya, retained the largest percentage of Anatolian early European farmer ancestry of all Europeans. On the other hand, the modern British population is descended over 90% from the Yamnaya-descended bell beaker culture that entered Britain about 4,500 years ago. This means that the people who built most of Stonehenge between 5,100 and 4,600 years ago then disappeared and were almost entirely replaced by a new Yamnaya descended population just a century later. Now, it does seem that the newcomers valued the monument, though, because the final circle and horseshoe of smaller blue stones seems to have been added by the Bell Beaker people. There has been a lot of speculation about whether the Yamnaya were brutal conquerors. And some of this was caused by the discovery of lots of weapons, as well as carts, in their graves. The nerdier among my audience might also recognize that the term Kurgan was used in the original Highlander movie in 1986 as the name for the main antagonist. And it was explained that the word Kurgan described the barbarian culture that he had come from. Now, it is likely that some violence probably accompanied the spread of a new culture, especially in places and times when it completely replaced an earlier population. However, it's also possible that the Yamnaya were opportunists who took advantage of a plague that spread either with them or just ahead of their expansion. And to learn a little bit more about this, I've included in the text that I told you about a link to a recent talk done by David Reich, the geneticist who wrote the best-selling book, Who We Are and How We Got Here. Now, Yersinia pestis is a bacterium that diverged from an earlier bacterium called Yersinia pseudotuberculosis about 5,700 years ago and spread across Europe and Central Asia. Yersinia pestis genes have been found in burials across Europe beginning about 5,000 years ago. And plague seems to have caused population declines that varied by region, but ranged from 30% to 60%. Although this same bacterium later caused bubonic plague, in this wave, the disease seems to have been pneumonic plague. Now, the difference is that while bubonic plague is spread by fleas and attacks the lymph nodes and has about a 50% mortality rate over an illness period of about 2 weeks, pneumonic plague is spread by airborne respiratory droplets, coughing, and attacks the lungs and has a nearly 100% fatality rate in less than 2 days. And the genes of this bacterium have also been discovered in Yamnaya burials, dating back about 4,500 years. But it's unclear whether the Yamnaya spread the plague or were the victims of it. Either way, rapid depopulation would have facilitated their expansion into Europe. But what about the East? In India, the imposition of colonial rule by first the British East India Company in the 18th century and then the British Empire in the 19th century had long-lasting effects on interpretations of the Indian past. British linguists and historians, many of whom did show very sincere interest in understanding Indian languages and history, even so, sometimes brought their ideas and assumptions about the relative values of Eastern and Western cultures into their histories of India. A persistent issue that has lasted to the present has been the belief that the main ancient Indian language, Sanskrit, as well as most of Indian culture, had been brought to the subcontinent by people called Aryans from the West. Now, we've already discussed 2 waves of either migration or cultural influence that brought agriculture to Europe 7,000 years ago, and then brought the Yamnaya and their descendant cultures between 5,500 and 4,600 years ago. Some scholars have suggested that the same influences and maybe even the same people may have spread in both directions. From an origin point around the Fertile Crescent, ancient Persia, that's modern-day Iran, or the Middle East. And there does seem to be evidence that wheat was adopted in India beginning about 9,000 years ago, and that by about 8,500 years ago, wheat cultivation had reached central India and even the Ganges River Valley. At about the same time, rice cultivation, pioneered in China, was also reaching India. So ideas from these 2 different agricultural regions would be mixed together in India and added to techniques that the Indians had developed themselves, such as growing cotton and domesticating zebu cattle. British historians in the 19th century suggested that Sanskrit and many elements of Indians' Vedic culture, which we'll talk about in future lectures, had been brought from the outside by immigrants or invaders from the West. Many Indians resisted this narrative, calling it the Aryan Invasion Myth. And as we'll see going forward, Indian prehistory and Indian history are both very complex. So the truth is probably not entirely one thing or entirely the other. One interesting, very recent potential discovery, which has been facilitated by new computational techniques, suggests that the Sanskrit language may be much older in India than had been previously believed. An Indian computer scientist and cryptographer named Yamnaya has claimed in an article written in 2022 that he has decoded over 500 inscriptions or seals from the Indus Valley civilization, which is one of those that we are going to talk about in the next chapter. He claims that the language used in the seals is already Sanskrit, which would mean that Indians may have been speaking Sanskrit 1,000 years before the arrival of the Vedic culture, who we will also cover later. He also suggests that many of the cultural elements that were thought to have been Vedic may actually have existed and been mentioned in these ancient seals. And this would suggest that by the time of the Indus Valley civilization, which rose about 4,600 years ago, that this language and culture were already pretty well established in India. And if you're interested in the text that goes with this, I've included a link to a YouTube video in which Devam summarizes his argument in a half-hour presentation, which is one of the shortest ones that he has done so far. Now, although this controversy is relatively new, the heat that it has generated in both its advocates and in its opponents shows how disagreements about even ancient history can be extremely relevant to the identities that inform people's ideas of religion, ethnicity, and nationality today. And these identities, of course, lead to action. So you can imagine how a new understanding of the origins of the Indian language and culture could have implications in both national and international politics. In the next chapter, we will discuss the Indus Valley civilization, as well as several other river valley kingdoms that rose in the Copper and Bronze Ages. But that's all for now. So I hope you found this a little bit interesting. Thanks very much for watching, and I will see you again very soon.